right jolly. The old elf's cheeks were crimson as the crushed velvet jacket and pants he'd pulled out of the wardrobe. Sitting on the deerskin coverlet, he practically fell off the bed, bending over to put his boots on. His ears filling with his own gasps, he heard Mrs. Claus say, "Would you like a Coke?" "No," he said to his assistant, who wasn't any more his wife than Jack White's wife was his sister, and puffed on the pipe clenched in his teeth. "Those bastards haven't paid me since I posed for Mexican Coke. Get me some Pepsi." "We have 7-Up. Fuck, 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 fuck. I'll just smoke my pipe. God damn the supply chain." Mrs. Claus went away anyway. "Don't mix it with RC, Santa called, immediately coughing. He buckled his right boot and then the left. He sat up, feeling the blood rush from his head, and, putting a hand on the bedpost where his pointed red cap was, attempted standing. Mrs. Claus came back in, a glass of yellowish liquid in her hand. She was dressed all in red. "Do we have to do this year?" said Santa. Mrs. Claus only said, "Not my call, boss." She handed him the glass. "Come on," Santa said, gulping down the drink. "Mountain Dew," he muttered. He looked at Mrs. Claus, and she looked at him with a look as weary as his. Santa put his cap on. "I'll tell them." They went into the hall, both pushing open the frosty double doors. "Ho, ho, ho!" Santa shouted. "Ha, ha!" laughed Mrs. Claus. They looked at the citizens of Santa Town. "Friends," bellowed Santa, not that he'd known any in his entire existence, "I must announce that Christmas will be canceled this year." The elves stood in the snow. The reindeer stared. "Moan," said Mrs. Claus. The light in Rudolph's nose went out, making a damp zapping sound. "We're being recorded," Santa said. "He's making a list. He's checking it twice," an elf, or even a reindeer, half sang. "Norelco," breathed Santa. "Contract." Hermie came forward. "Yes, Herbie," Mrs. Claus said officiously. "We've been thinking," said the wannabe dentist. "Doing this it's canceled thing each year is like pulling teeth." Rudolph, unscrewing his nose and tossing it into a snowbank, said, "It's never really canceled." A gruff voice from the little factory began to be heard. An elf with a goatee ran forward. "You left the door open," Hermie said to him as he approached. "No need to keep the factory warm," said the goateed elf, looking threateningly at everyone, including the Clauses. "We're not pretending to care this year if Christmas is canceled." You could have heard a snowflake fall. From over the pines, the elves, the reindeer, Mrs. Claus, and Santa himself heard a haunted voice singing Ghost Riders in the Sky. Mrs. Claus fell to her knees. "He's singing his hit. He's finally happy." The head elf said to Santa Claus, "There's no need to announce that Christmas is canceled this year. We don't object." The elves bowed their heads. Hermie said, "We didn't think you were with us." The head elf said, "I was pissed off all those other years because I knew we'd always actually have Christmas." The reindeer, the elves, and Mrs. Claus looked at Santa. "Don't look at me," said Santa Claus. They ran to get the Bumble, finding him in a crevice where an avalanche had been. They got him to crawl out after promising to let him eat the toy shop where they'd toiled many seasons. Hermie offered to nail his teeth back in first because he'd kept them, but the abominable snowman simply swallowed the workshop whole. The reindeer shouted out with glee. Yukon Cornelius, transcontinental that he was, telegraphed Coke, Pepsi, and Norelco to tell them the cancellation ritual was itself canceled because Christmas wasn't going to be a thing this year or next year. The next morning they could hear the voices of Whoville singing Dahudores. "Jesus," said Santa, turning to Mrs. Claus, "we may have to revive Christmas next year." "Anything to keep them from singing that," said Mrs. Claus. And now she was Mrs. Claus. They'd married at midnight, the exact moment Christmas was canceled, for real.